Good afternoon. I'm hoping you're enjoying the final day of our conference. This session that you're in now is making STEM concepts accessible to students with disabilities. A little bit about myself. My name is Valerie Lill. I got married during the pandemic, but I've been unable to legally change my name yet. So it will be Chapman Jones, but for now, all my information is still Lill. I am the IU12 AT, which stands for Assistive Technology Trainer and Consultant. There's my contact information and my phone number, and I also have a Twitter page if you're interested in following. My background, as indicated by the letters behind my name and some of the things at the bottom, is I am a certified speech language pathologist. I worked in the schools for over 19 years. I got interested in assistive technology because I worked with students with moderate to significant disabilities, most of whom needed some form of assistive technology. I also got involved because I had previously been in the ed tech department at LIU. I had gotten involved in some of the STEM work and kind of trying to join together assistive technology with STEM. So that is kind of how I got involved in this aspect of my work. Okay, the meeting norms. Now, you've probably heard these multiple times by now. So we want engagement. Now I may ask for some participation or ask you to say something out loud if you're comfortable. You could also choose to put something in the chat if I ask a question. I believe I have a poll coming up a little bit early on in the presentation. I recognize that engagement's going to look different for everyone because some people aren't comfortable with talking in this kind of setting. I'll honor all perspectives heard, and I assume you all have good intentions by being here, as I have good intentions by being your presenter today with the content I'm sharing with you. Don't forget about those Act 48 credits. They're awarded after you finish the evaluation, but you have to do all the sessions for the day. When you're done with that, if you get it in by July 31st, you can get a copy of Dr. Young's book if you're one of the first 100 people who are registered for today. So that's some good, pretty good incentive. The webinar outcomes for today, I want you to talk about some ways we're going to talk about how to make STEM vocabulary a little bit more accessible to all learners, because some of the vocabulary is a bit overwhelming. I want you to see if you could come up with at least 2 unplugged online, it should say, or technology resources that you can use with your students. I'm a big on, if you've ever been to one of my presentations before, either here or earlier from the IU, I share a lot of resources. I put a lot of hyperlinks in and share resources. That's just what I like to do, because then you can choose. I'm not going to tell you which resources, oh, you use this resource. You can look at what's going to work best for you and for your students. Okay, what is STEM? STEM, we all know what that stands for. Science, technology, engineering, math. Sometimes you'll see it listed as STEAM, where they add the art, science, technology, engineering, art, and math. And if you've been to any of the STEM trainings at LIU, Ben Smith is very involved in that. He'll talk about the 4 strands of STEM, which are coding, building, designing, and creating. And I'm not going to talk about what is STEM in this. That's information. All right, STEM at school. The first question I'm going to ask, if you're comfortable, you can either unmute yourself, or you can post in the chat as far as what your role is, or, are you a tech educator? Are you a special educator? Or whatever, what your role is, just because that will help me get an idea of who my attendees are and what you know about the STEM at your school. Okay, thank you. Some of you I think I've seen before, but I can't remember what everybody does. So, okay, math, code, teaching, lots of, okay, reg ed, learning support. So we have a big mix of whatever, so a mix of teachers. Okay, so we have a mix of reg ed, special ed, support staff, school psych. I've seen a lot of school psychs the last few days. A lot of you have been attending, thank you. Okay, thank you. So now nobody here is a tech ed teacher or a STEM teacher at their school. So you may not know the answers, but I've just learned how to do polling in Zoom literally yesterday. So hopefully, hopefully it'll work the way I'm intending it to. I'm going to put up a poll about STEM at your school. I'm going to launch it. And I'll give you a minute or so to read over those options and answer. There's no wrong answer for these questions. I was just trying to get an idea of what's going on in your district. Okay, I'll give a few more seconds. I'm going to go for a minute. Looks like most people have responded. Don't worry, I can't see who put one response on my end. Well, I mean, I probably can, but I'm not going to look at that. That's not important to me. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and then I can share the results so that way you guys can see, oh, brand new hire to your district. That's totally fine then. That's totally fine. All right, can everybody see those poll results? So I asked what STEM instruction looks like at your building, and it looks like, which is kind of what I anticipated. Oh, another TAC, welcome. It kind of looks like it's different everywhere. Again, LIU, some of you I know are from not within LIU, but LIU has 25 districts that we support. So 25 districts can do things 25 different ways, as you know, just because I've worked with many of them. So I kind of expected these type of answers. Okay, previously a STEM teacher that came into your room. Okay, that was one of the options that nobody picked. Okay, we had one respondent said, okay, they take it like a STEM class, like a special. I know my son goes to a district, it's not within LIU 12 footprint, so I do feel comfortable using his school as an example. If you've been to any of my presentations, I often will use him as my example. They had like an elementary, I can't remember what they called it. It wasn't STEM, but they had like, it was called Explorations, but they had like it was like a special that they had once a week during their special time. And in middle school, they do something called cultural arts rotation. And it wasn't called STEM, but it was like sort of it was called Tech Ed too, but it was like a STEM class. So they had it for 6 weeks once a year, and that's how they did it. So he would be under number 1. Okay, so I did see a STEM teacher coming into classrooms. I've never worked anywhere where they did that, but I know that does happen sometimes. Computer teachers include STEM in their classes. I think that's fairly common. I love that 50% of the responders said they integrate STEM activities with my lessons because that's the way it should be. So that's awesome that some of you are already doing that. Hopefully some of the resources will work with your students with special needs. Somebody said they're not aware of any STEM instruction in their school. And that's also quite possible that that's happening. Thank you so much for sharing. Okay, I'm gonna close out that survey. You can't see what I'm doing. The recommendations, and again, a lot of you have it as a class, and you know, in districts I've worked and places I've been, that's what they're doing. But really the recommendation is to not do it as a class. Because the reasoning is, it's a way of thinking. So the principles of STEM, again, if we go back to the previous slide, coding, building, designing, creating can be applicable across curriculum in multiple classes. Not just, okay, we think coding, we think computer class, but building, designing, and creating, think about how that applies across a curriculum. Okay, I'm gonna go back. So what does STEM instruction look like in your district? I didn't quite get, we already discussed what that looked like. I did the presentation before I literally just added the poll, like I learned how to do it yesterday. So I just added it yesterday. So I had this in there. And obviously as what we were seeing is it looks different across every district. STEM for all learners. Again, we're thinking of, some of you are special education teachers, so obviously your learners are some students with different needs. And I'm sure those of you who are regular education teachers certainly have students with diverse needs in your classrooms. STEM is important because it teaches students several different skills. Procedural knowledge, how to do things, and these skills are applicable at all grade levels. How things fit together. Again, we're not just looking at facts, but processes. And something really important that STEM teaches is failure has to happen before success. So many kids want to get it perfect or right the first time, or people are afraid to fail. I'm in as an adult. I don't like failing. I'm sure a lot of you feel that way. But STEM is a lot of trial and error. It teaches that you're going to mess up several times before you get it right. And that's a great skill for students to have, to know that failure is part of our learning process. And all of our students, whether they're our regular education students or students with disabilities, should have that experience. That failing is not a bad thing, it just helps them learn. And again, those concepts are for everybody. Excuse me. All right, so let's thinking again, the focus of this is about STEM for students with disabilities. So we need to think about what are some of the obstacles our students have to learning STEM concepts. Now, none of you here are STEM teachers. Some of you were integrating STEM, but some of you are not teaching that. But you can still think about how these apply to your own students. And maybe these are things you've thought of or heard your STEM teachers or other folks say. Well, it's just too hard for my students. You know, I worked with life skills students, and I know a lot of the teachers, oh, well, they can't learn that, or this is too hard for them. The vocabulary is way above their level. Again, your kids who have some language differences or learning disabilities, language processing difficulties. Thinking of our kids with their physical disability. They're in wheelchairs, they can't move their hands. How are they supposed to use these STEM toys that maybe your STEM teacher has in their classroom? That the students just simply won't understand what you're trying to teach them. And again, just thinking for our special ed teachers, because the focus is on students with disabilities, how is this relevant? Why is STEM relevant? When I have IP goals I need to be working on, why should I be trying to incorporate STEM? But as we talked about on the previous slides, again, there's some important skills that all students can learn from STEM. So hopefully none of you are saying those things or your teachers aren't thinking those things. So I do want to talk first about STEM vocabulary. Because if you look, again, there aren't, Pennsylvania doesn't have standards for STEM, but there are recommended, I'm not going to go into that about what they're recommending and the vocabulary and things that's involved in STEM. But there are a lot of new and unfamiliar terms when it comes to things like coding and designing and building, words they may have never heard of before. And again, a lot of people think, well, these words my students won't understand. And I'm going to use this as an example because this is a word, I will be honest, when I first started going to STEM trainings, I didn't know what it meant. And I consider myself an intelligent person. I have a master's degree. I've been working for 20 years. I didn't know what an algorithm meant. I learned it from my son, actually, because he knows how to solve a Rubik's Cube. He learned it by memorizing the algorithms, and I didn't even know what that meant. So it's not just your special ed kids that might struggle with some of these STEM vocabulary words. So the definition in the STEM world of algorithm is a process or set of rules that followed in calculations or other problem-solving operations, especially by a computer. Blah, 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 okay, computer, set of rules. But that may be a really, kids, that doesn't, even if they understand or can read the definition, it doesn't mean they understand what an algorithm is. How can we make our kids understand what an algorithm is in an easier way? We need to first make our vocabulary accessible. And this may be coming from my speech and language background about how you can simplify vocabulary, but you want to make it an easier explanation. How can we make that complicated definition on my previous page, which may not mean a whole lot to our students, or especially our younger students and our students with disabilities? How can we make it easier? We want to simplify the vocabulary in the simplest terms possible, and we want to use examples that are relatable. And again, what that's going to look like is certainly going to depend on your students' ages, and if you're working with students with disabilities, it's going to depend on their ability and their cognition level of what you want that to look like. But again, we always want to challenge our students, so we don't want to make it too simple. We want to try to find a happy medium. So let's look at a STEM vocabulary redo. There's that long definition of algorithm that is the definition that is often used for explaining what it is in the STEM world. Simplified definition. It's a list of steps. it tells you how to do something. And again, it's a process. Because it defines a process, it's a list of steps. My son memorized the algorithm for the Rubik's Cube. He memorized a list of steps and a procedure in his head, so he knew how to do it. Same thing. So there's a simplified version. Again, you might be able to give your students something between these. You might not need it to be quite as simple as this, but you might not want to be quite as complicated. You want to kind of keep the essence of the definition, but just make it in a little bit simpler terms. That will depend on the level of your students. I'm going to show you some examples of real life examples your kids can relate to. Well, what is an algorithm? I'm just using that one particular vocabulary term, but you can use this for your STEM vocabulary or really any vocabulary. A daily schedule is an example of an algorithm. It is a list of steps. They go in a predictable order. Again, first you do this, then you do this, then you do this. This is what you need to get through to get to what? What's the thing at the end? Okay, the end of your school day. So you can use a daily schedule even with the students in a multi-disabilities classroom. I'll just use that as an example because we think of those being our students with some of the most significant impairments or your autism support classrooms. There's almost always a picture or a visual schedule hanging in the classroom. A simple way to incorporate STEM, you're going over your schedule. Oh, here's our daily schedule. Remember, our daily schedule, we can also call it an algorithm. It's a list of steps that we need to get through so we can finish our day. And just repeating that so that word isn't unfamiliar. If those students are in an inclusion classroom, for example, for their specials, because a lot of you said you had STEM as a special, if the teacher's bringing up the word algorithm in the STEM special, then those students have heard it before in your classroom. Oh, when our teacher talked about the schedule, okay, she said the word algorithm. And again, even if they're nonverbal, they're hearing this information. So we make the assumption that they're hearing it and they're understanding that information. So again, so every day when you bring that up or talk about a schedule, you can throw that word algorithm in there so they're hearing it. I'm going to give another example. Again, I worked in life skills. I worked in MDS, autism support. There were a lot of like cooking activities or crafts that had steps by steps, but I just threw it a simple example of making dirt cake because it seems every elementary life skills class I ever worked in seemed to do this. So recipes, you can use, a recipe is like an algorithm. It gives us a list of steps we need to follow in order to make our special treat for today, for example. So again, thinking of real life, relatable examples and just fitting that STEM vocabulary in. You're not teaching them, we're not going to do a lesson today on what an algorithm is. Rather, you're incorporating it into natural contexts. So that way they hear the word and are familiar with it. When it comes up again, STEM should be integrated, and this is a simple way to integrate STEM is by putting the vocabulary in and relating it to what you're already doing. Again, I just chose one vocabulary word to use as an example. And then for your students, again, those are for maybe the recipes and the schedules. Thinking for your other students, your learning support students or other students who maybe don't need quite as much support, but still have some difficulty with the vocabulary. Math problem solving procedures, again, are like an algorithm because why? It's a list of steps to solve a problem. So I still remember in 4th grade learning how to do long division, and our teacher said, and I'm sure this is outdated because this was in the early 80s, but divide, multiply, subtract, bring down. You know, I literally had that 35 years ago. I can still remember that algorithm or list of steps. But again, you're going over lists of steps to solve math problems. You can throw in the word algorithm to help. Oh, well, we're going to use an algorithm to solve these problems. That's just a simple, just a fancy way of saying it's a list of steps that we need to do to solve these problems. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm going to go on. Okay, got a thumbs up. Thank you, Courtney. Now, I talked about vocabulary, and again, that doesn't matter what population you're working with, whether it's your regular education student, whether you have a class where there's students included who have some disabilities, whether you're in a self-contained class, which some of you, based on what classrooms you're in, it sort of sounds like that, you can still incorporate that STEM, figuring out ways to incorporate that STEM vocabulary. So the next thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to transition to the second objective of this webinar is talking about accessible STEM activities. Now, we all know our students have different needs, their ages, their ability, again, their cognition, their language skills, and your physical disability, the physical abilities, their motor, their fine and gross motor abilities. Those are all going to impact our students with disabilities and their ability to participate in STEM activities. So they're all going to need to participate in different ways. So that's just something you need to consider, because just looking back at what you guys said, so we had somebody who was an autism support, a school psychologist that obviously interact with a variety of students. We had ES, a high school co-teaches math, and we had regular ed. So you're all going to, oops, sorry about that, have different students you're working with who are going to have very different ability levels. And even if you might have a student in regular education, but that doesn't mean they're not going to have some fine motor difficulties or physical disabilities also. So this is a link that as I said at the beginning, I love to share resources. That's something I do in many of my presentations, and then you can pick and choose which of those resources are going to meet your needs. So I did want to, this is a resource, hopefully it works. Again, this has some information about STEM accessibility, and I'm not going to sit here and go through it, but it just things to consider. How do we consider how accessible things are? And it's, again, information resources. It has information about technology. Again, a lot of STEM classes are using computers. Thinking about that, about how do the students access the computer is part of that. There's some general things to do. Blind and low vision, learning disabilities, motor impairment. So they have lots of suggestions of having access, how to promote equal access in your classroom, and things to consider. And again, that kind of goes under, they have the phrase universal design for learning, if you've heard of that. If not, I did do an intro presentation on that on day 1, if you want more information. But again, it's questions to ask yourself, first of all, just to look at general accessibility of your STEM activities. But of course, I'm not just gonna give you that. I'm gonna give you actual activity resources. So, I'm starting with some of these are going to be unplugged, meaning unplugged means they don't need the computer to use, because we know for some of our kids, they physically may have difficulty with that, or it just may be overwhelming, or some of our kids with cognitive impairments. I do some things that are preschool STEM activities. Do I think preschool STEM activities are going to be appropriate for high school students, regardless of age and ability? No. However, again, I didn't know who was going to be attending, so I wouldn't have activities appropriate for a variety of population. So we could think of our students, in elementary students, maybe in our life skills or MDS, who maybe need some of the activities a little bit simpler for them. So again, these are all hyperlinks. So these are, again, you can adapt. And the thing is, yes, it says preschool activities, but if you like this STEM activity, you can adapt it to meet your students' needs. But they have tons of activities under here that you can look at. And again, you have to see what's going to work for your students. And again, this one's the same thing. This lists STEAM and science experiments. And again, so if you're a class who's maybe a life skills class at the elementary level who makes crafts to practice following directions. Again, I worked on lots of life skills at MDS. We did crafts, we did recipes for following directions and taking turns and communication. Instead of maybe doing a craft, what about doing some STEM activities? Thinking about that. Instead of making a project, have a STEM activity where we can incorporate that science, the science, technology, engineering, math into those classrooms, instead of having that just be a special. There's no reason you couldn't do some of these activities. Again, here's 28 hands-on STEM activities for kids. Again, hands-on, these are unplugged activities, so you're not gonna need them to be able to access the computer. And they even have it, they had it listed by date. They did one for each day for the month of February. I'm glad you like the resources. I'm a huge fan of giving resources and you picking what works. Now, teachers pay teachers. I will be the first to admit, mixed feelings about the content that is on there. I only ever get anything that's free. I'm certainly not paying somebody to make something that I can make something myself. But if you go on Teachers Pay Teachers, and this is just a hyperlink to it. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it by now. But if you type into the search STEM for special needs or STEM for special education, there are activities that are going to come up, some for free, some for purchase. We'll see if I can get it to work first. Again, I'm not logged in as me, but type it in, things come up. I had worked in an upper elementary life skills classroom, and we did STEM activities all the time. Now, keep in mind, I was a speech pathologist. I came in and did push-in and worked on students' goals. We used to do science projects and science activities together, and I would fit in their language goals, such as using communication devices, or if they had some social goals like turn taking, if they had to practice vocabulary skills, I incorporated that into those, and we did a lot of these type of fun science hands-on activities. And the kids, again, that thinking of UDL engagement, this is some kids hate making crafts because it doesn't mean anything to them, but you get some hands-on science activities, kids love them. So of course, I am the AT Assistive Technology Trainer and Consultant. I have to do a little plug and talk about, because it is very relevant for this topic, about assistive technology and STEM, because some of our students are not going to be able to access STEM activities the same way as other students. They will need some assistive technology to be able to access the activities. So I found this article and I thought it was great, and this can apply all the way up if anybody here is doing high school. And this is relevant, you can certainly share this. Making science labs accessible. And again, hyperlink, of course, and you can click on it. There are, again, you can download this as a PDF. I did not give you the direct PDF in case you wanted to go to the website, but there it is. There's a printer-friendly version. You can certainly share this of, you know, how can your schools make their science labs more accessible? Again, universal design for learning. I certainly have, this is not the point of this talk, but it's important to know that, but it has to do with giving options and reducing the barriers. Universal design for learning reduces the barriers in the sense of a science classroom. Think of all the physical and safety barriers there might be to students with disabilities in those settings. So again, if you look here, there's lists based on blindness, low vision, mobility impairments, your kids in wheelchairs, all kinds of things that, again, LD and attention disabilities, those are some pretty common things. All ways you can look at, all strategies you can look at to make your science classes, whether it's in your own class, if you're incorporating STEM, if you're a reg ed teacher, or if they're in a high school science class. Universal design considerations, these are not for special ed kids. These are for everyone to make everything more accessible to all your students, whether they have disabilities or not. And again, there's a whole list of ideas and additional resources, general, the list goes on. I love that they have speech in there. So that's a great resource for all of anyone who teaches science, whether reg ed, special ed, again, a STEM teacher, that's a great resource to share with them, to think about, are they making their science labs accessible to all students, regardless if they have disabilities or not. There also is a website for accessible science equipment. So not just making the lab accessible, and again, it's from Do It, it's from the same company, but again, measuring, you know, I can give an example of a student I worked with. He used a communication device to speak because he had some disabilities that he was nonverbal. He was in regular ed second grade for certain subject areas, including science, and they were doing measuring. And his teacher's like, well, he has some physical disabilities. He can't hold a ruler. How's he supposed to measure? Well, there are measuring apps on the iPad. All he had to do was hold the iPad up to it, which his physical abilities allowed him to do, and he could measure things. So there's always ways around it through using assistive technology. So again, here's some ideas for accessible measuring devices. Talking equipment for your kids who are blind or have visual impairments, or students who maybe have who understand language but have difficulty with expression. They could listen to what it says. Again, stirring all kinds of information to share. Non-slip mats, Dyson, your OTs probably use that a lot. But just different things that you can do to make your science lessons more accessible. I'm also big on using what's in front of you. I don't know what operating systems your schools use. However, if these are all hyperlinked, and you can look to use those built-in accessibility options on your iPads, on your Google Chromebooks. There are on your MacBooks, whatever the kids are using, you might need to use some of the accessibility options, such as if you have iPads, they could use some of the accessibility options to have them read worksheets out loud if the kids are not able to do that, to have them read the directions out loud. Again, we want to make these kids as independent as possible in these STEM classes, using these built-in accessibility options once they're taught how to use them is one way to do that. Computer access. Some of you, if any of you have any kids with physical disabilities, which I don't know, and you can have even kids in Reg Ed who have physical differences that make it difficult to access computers. We have, if you're within the LIU footprint, we do have an AT lending library, and there's a hyperlink to it right there, and you can request things right through the page, and it'll go through me. We have some equipment that can help kids access computers if they can't. And these are just some examples. A switch kit USB. I know when I worked at a school that had exploration, always use these switch click USB switches. Again, it's a single hit USB switch. He used to use those with his kids, with the students I worked with. It's an interface that works with the iPad to make things accessible. A Bluetooth switch. Again, these are all options. You can certainly contact me if you want more information on making the computers more accessible to our students who have physical differences, who have difficulty accessing a traditional mouse and computer. But that may be needed in your STEM class if you're doing STEM. Excuse me. There are a lot of coding resources. I don't know if any of your schools do like hour of code, because coding is one of the 4 areas under STEM. Do any of your schools do hour of code? The schools I always worked in always did, at least I think it was just like in September, but really coding is something they should work on throughout the school year. However, and again, there are ways to make coding accessible to our students with disabilities. We just have to think kind of outside the box. It's a separate class, okay? And that may be the case. It might be in your STEM special that they're doing hour of code and coding, and that's fine also. And certainly feel free to share these resources with your STEM teachers, especially if your kids with disabilities are going to those classes. I had students who had physical impairments and cognitive impairments, but they still went out they got like an adapted STEM special, but they also went out to the Reg Ed STEM special. How can we get these kids to still participate? So you can use AT to make choices. A no-tech choice. Again, when we're coding, we're giving directions to complete a task. For example, some of the really simple coding ones, okay, make it go left, make it go right, turn the light on, turn it off, those kind of things, like Ozobots. And again, I am going to talk about some of those toys in a little bit, but excuse me. This no tech choices. I have kids who are auditory scanners, and you just, when you get to the one you want, okay, do you want the robot to go left or right? And then you give them the choices again and wait for a reaction. Do you want the robot to go left? And if they react, okay, we're going to make it go left. So that way they're getting some control. Because one of my biggest pet peeves with these students is adults doing everything for them. Giving these kids choices is the way to build independence. Don't just program the robot for them. Let them figure out a way they can choose. Selecting icons. You might have pictures representing on, off, for the lights. Okay, what do you want it to do next? Do you want the light to turn on, or do you want it to stay off, and having them touch the icons? Low-tech choices, switches. Maybe they have 2 Little Mac switches that have those same choices. One says left with an icon on it for left, or the word left written on it, hopefully. One has right. You let them pick, because when you're coding and doing some of these hour code things, there are no right or wrong answers for some of these really easy programs. They can make it do whatever they want. These are all hyperlinks. I'm certainly not going through them, of some coding resources that may be considered more accessible for your kids. These are, I know Lightbot Hour was one that we used to use at the elementary level with life skills and multi-disabled students with multiple disabilities. I didn't work in AS at the elementary level. I only did that in middle school and high school. But again, this one has some pre-reader activities, an hour of code, and you can look through all these. I'm not going to go through them all, but there's even a coding activity set. If you want to stay away from computers, again, these things aren't free, but again, you could see here how a student could choose the arrow. Do you want to stop, or do they want the arrow? Those could be your choices on students can have with a switch. You want to fit those choices in so our kids are participating and not just having people do it for them. Okay, this is a huge list. There are many, many, many hands-on STEM tools that can be purchased, that some, if you have a STEM teacher, a STEM class, maybe they have some of these things. I know we have some in our IU and they're working on a STEM lending library. Maybe you have seen some of these before. I don't know if you could just glance through this list. Do any of these look familiar? Is it something that they might have in your school? You could just put it in the chat or unmute yourself if you want. If any of these you either heard of or you know they have at your school. I know one person said she was new, so obviously she doesn't know, but maybe in a previous work setting, if you've seen any of these used before. Okay, so some of these you've, okay. Okay, good. So some of you do know these. Great. Yeah, the Ozobot. I know my son, I can give an example. When he went to the same elementary school I worked at that had the MDS and life skills classes, he was not in those classes, but they had the Makey, the Ozobot, Sphero, they had a bunch of these. And like I said, those students were integrated for specials, so they certainly had access. I tried to put a lot of different ones on here. Some of these are going to be more accessible to your students. Many of the names are familiar, yeah. Some of these are going to be more accessible to your students than others. For example, if you know the B-Bot, it's, oh, of course that links, oh no, why is that hyperlink not working? All right, let me go, I don't know why that didn't, I'll have to change that link. I just checked all these. It's the right company. For some reason, it just didn't take me to the B-Bot page. I'll have to fix that. Now it's gonna be slow because I'm at home. All right. Well, the B-Bot, it literally looks like a bee and you can program it. And it has buttons on the back that you can program. Well, we can think some of our kids with disabilities, they don't have the fine motor skills to access this, or they just may have trouble just holding it. They might be the kind of kid who's gonna throw it across the room. But you can see there's arrows on it, left, right, up, down, giving them those choices so they can help. They're still helping program it, even if they're not doing the physical programming on that. And another one that's similar is the Botley. So if you, what's nice about this, that's, again, it does a similar thing where you program it. It has this remote. So if you have a student in a wheelchair, maybe can't get to the ground and program that Botley, you can hand them the remote and they can maybe access that instead. But again, there's many. Makey is being, my son has one of these. I still trying to figure out how I can use it at work for a presentation, but this is something you can use to make switches, for example. And again, and some of these are a little bit more advanced, like the Hummingbird and the Arduino and the Raspberry Pi. But again, some of these are a little bit simpler. But again, if you have, these are some hands-on STEM tools. If you have any of these things, you might be able to, excuse me, use them in your classroom. Again, this is a marble. Again, if you have, again, it has some directions, but you might have a marble kit, a marble set already as an indoor recess thing. You can use that as a hands-on STEM tool with your students. And I'm obviously not, in the interest of time, I'm not going through all those. One of the biggest things I think is STEM and special education buy-in. I've not necessarily heard these from teachers and administration, maybe a little bit, but I've also heard it from parents. Well, why does my kid need to be in that class? Or why should my kid be in this class? You know, my kid can't even write their name and you want them to do STEM activities. But if we go back to earlier in the presentation when I was talking about it, it builds, there's a lot of skills that come out of STEM, the problem solving and the handling failure, trial and error skills that all students need. And STEM is again, it's not supposed to be a class, it's a way of thinking. So I do have some resources if you get any of those naysayers like, well, these kids, why do they need that? Or you want to try to get some of these tools for your class if you're in like a self-contained environment. There's some resources I can share. Again, there's a great article on honoring learners with special needs in STEM, and it gives some real life examples and how you can include these students. And also, here's another one. Again, how can the tech help them thrive? That's what we want for our students. They could thrive in STEM education. Again, here's another great article of research, and there's lots of resources in there too. again, about how you can get these students. Thinking about our universal design for learning, the multiple means of engagement. STEM is a great way to get students engaged. They think these toys and the activities, they're fun, they're exciting. If you're going to get them engaged, then you're going to get them learning. Just some considerations for you. This is things you can think about. What standard, again, we talked earlier about making the vocabulary accessible. Which of the standards in vocabulary do you want to expose your students to? And again, that may be something to discuss. If you have a class, which again, the majority of you did, that was like a STEM special, find out from the teacher, okay, you have some 3rd and 4th graders in an autism support class. Find out from the teacher, what vocabulary are the 3rd and 4th graders doing in their STEM special? Those would be the things, the concepts and the vocabulary you want your kids to be familiar with. I want you to think about, I presented a ridiculous number of resources because that's typically what I do. I always give out, I'm the queen of resources. Which of those things I showed you do you think your students can use? You can look through those. Coding, again, hour of codes, your students should not be excluded from the hour of code because they have a disability. That is something most schools do, and they do it for everyone. Which of those, maybe your teachers don't know which of these activities they can do, but I gave you some examples of how to get those students involved in the hour of code. So which of those resources can your kids use? And then we need to think about, well, okay, I think my kids could do some of these, but they might need some accommodations. They might need, again, maybe they could do the things on the computer, but they can't access a traditional mouse. How can I get them to make selections on the computer? Again, there's no answers for today, just things to think about going ahead. Okay, that is the end of my talking. I am a talker and I tend to talk fast, and I'm sorry if I went too fast for you, but you have the slides and you have my contact information to access. Do you have any questions or comments or any specific experiences with your students with disabilities in STEM classes? Those of you who teach students with disabilities, are they involved in STEM? Do they go to the STEM specials? Or are you doing it in your classroom? That's a great point. Yes, I talked about this earlier today when I did a presentation on CS for All. I'm talking about teaching our students, getting them involved in computer science. And there was another IU I know that did a presentation at the CS All for conference, and they talked about that. I think it was an ES teacher. And when she had her kids involved in these activities, the behaviors went down. But that's, you know what that is? That's the engagement piece. They enjoy these activities. That's great. Yeah, you have to be careful about the behaviors. That's why I brought up like the B-bot, and they could throw it, but that doesn't mean they can't program a B-bot. They can tell you how to program it. And if they're nonverbal, they can use icons. If they're verbal, they can tell you, make it go left, right, up, down, on, off, right? There's other ways around it if they can't use the equipment. You just have to be creative and think about it. Anyone else? And I did, I saw Susan about the light tech. There definitely were unplugged activities. So those do not use technology. So those might be where you want to start looking at some of those unplugged activities. And again, I didn't have them labeled as such, but the page with the teachers pay teachers and the science activities, some of those, they were not using the technology, most of those activities. Okay, so please don't forget to complete your evaluations. Decide if this training met your expectations. Decide how you're going to share or use your information. Again, none of you are STEM teachers. Maybe you want to share this with them. This would be a great resource for them. They might, especially if they have students with disabilities that are in their STEM classes, which I hope they do. What key information resonated with you? And some of you had shared that. There is one, if you can hang on, there is one more round of trainings, presentations. You do have a little bit of a break because there weren't too many questions or comments. So we are wrapped up. The next sessions will start at 2:45 p.m. I'm done presenting though. So, but I will be attending one more session. You're very welcome. Thank you so much for coming. So, take a little bathroom break and decide what you're going to do for your 2:45 session. And don't forget to fill out those evaluations. Thank you so much.